also how they are intellectually dishonest when it comes to critique of their own worldview. So, for example, so you earlier on mentioned about Dawkins and the God delusion. There are very well educated atheists who frown upon the God delusion. And
Right.
again, you were mentioning about philosophy and logic, and people who some Muslims who supposedly say you're not supposed to use it. Well, let's look at what a philosopher of science, Michael Roos, who's considered the most eminent academic in the world because of the number of publications he has, and he's cited everywhere. He said the God delusion made me embarrassed to be an atheist. Right? I mean,
Right.
we're not. I mean, this is also very important. You mentioned about remastering philosophy. So, if someone was to look at the works of Michael Roos and then use them to actually show why Dawkins is wrong, what is wrong with that? What is wrong with that? With use of philosophy to actually challenge these erroneous ideas. I mean, his book. I mean, I went through it twice. The way I describe it is it's impossible to underestimate his arguments. They're so poor. It's so underwhelming when you read the book.
And he did it with such arrogance.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Look, we study, philosophies. We study logic for decades, and this guy comes in and starts telling us what's logical because he has a background in science. And I don't even think he's a scientist.
Well,
I think.
So
Like, what's his degree? What's his actual training?
So just on this point, you made a very good point, and I just wanted to intervene there because something happened 2 days ago. Ed Wilson, who is a eminent scientist, who is the father of sociobiology, which later on became into evolutionary psychology, and somebody who is very well respected in the field. He passed away, right? And he passed away, and him and Richard Dawkins actually have a very colorful history, because Richard Dawkins, he popularized the idea of the selfish gene based upon the theory of kin selection, which he is not the originator of that idea. He merely popularized the selfish gene perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Ed Wilson, who, again, he didn't have a religious bone in his body. He was this ardent secularist. A few years ago, he challenged the selfish gene perspective, the kin selection paradigm, with group selection. And what happened is there was an online dispute between Richard Dawkins and Ed Wilson. And Ed Wilson was being challenged by Dawkins. And Ed Wilson is somebody who is in academia. He has a huge status. However, in the popular sphere, Dawkins reigns far more greater. Right. In the public eye. So Dawkins was using his leverage to actually, his public leverage to challenge him, because essentially what Ed Wilson was doing was he was challenging the idea of the selfish gene, which makes Richard Dawkins look bad. So Richard Dawkins started saying things like, there's all these scientists who support me and all of this. And Ed Wilson replied, well, if science worked according to numbers, then we'd still believe in the a geocentric view of the solar system and so on and so forth. Anyway, their dispute spiraled out of control, and it ended up on BBC Newsnight. On BBC Newsnight, Ed Wilson was asked about his dispute with Richard Dawkins. And Ed Wilson, firstly, just before he went into Dawkins, he said, no scientist can say there is no God. So he's again more like, he doesn't say those categorical statements. But anyway, what Ed Wilson says is that there is no dispute between me and Richard Dawkins, because my disputes are with scientists, with researchers doing lab work. Richard Dawkins is a science journalist who reports what the scientists do. And this got me really rattled when I came across this a few years ago, because I always thought of him as a scientist. And when I actually did some research and looked into it, he has a PhD from Oxford in zoology. However, technically a scientist is someone who is doing research in the field, coming up with novel work, and Richard Dawkins has not been doing that. He's actually been an apologist for militant atheism for the majority of his life, and also he has been regurgitating the works of scientists. So a better description is somebody who is a science journalist rather than a scientist. And what's interesting is you pointed that out yourself. However, we have credible evidence that not only Ed Wilson, but other scientists in evolutionary biology frown upon him. And I just want to plug another book, which is after Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. There's another book called The Selfish Dawkins, or basically, I covered this book with Professor Shoaib Ahmed Malik on my channel, and it's a book written by a secularist and agnostic or an atheist. I've forgotten who she is, and she explains how Richard Dawkins has misrepresented evolutionary biology to fit his militant atheistic perspective. So we have to understand that these people.
That's my view. That's my view of him.
Yeah.
He's ramming his own personal. He's ramming his own personal worldview into science. He's conflating the two. Science has nothing to do with God. Philosophers of science tell us that science is the faith that the future will behave like the past. That's the kernel of what science is. It doesn't answer the question of God. It doesn't pose the question of God. There's no scientific experiment for knowing whether God exists or not. It's irrelevant to the scientific method. Yeah, he's selling books. He's selling books.
This is the book, The Selfish Genius, right, by Fern Baker. And the reason I'm highlighting this is to show that he is not somebody that we should, really. I mean, like you said, right? It's self-serving what he's doing. Now, yesterday on Twitter, not yesterday, 2 days ago on Twitter, when Richard Dawkins put up his, because Ed Wilson passed away, and he put up a sort of tribute to him. But
who passed away?
Ed Wilson, the one who.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So I just want to read out something which I thought was very sneaky of him, right? So can you see this, right?
Yeah, I do.
Sad news of the death of Ed Wilson. He's a great blah blah blah, all these things, right? But then he says, great Darwinian, single exception, blind spot over kin selection, right? Here he's referring to Ed Wilson challenging Dawkins' popularized idea of the selfish gene, right? So what I did in return for this tweet, I did something cheeky, which is I put up the clip from BBC News now. Right? I'm just going to play that. I'm going to remove my.
Categorically, there is no such thing as God.
I know you've had quite a big history with Richard Dawkins and a different view of the natural selection process. Where are we on that now, in your view?
There is no dispute between me and Richard Dawkins, and never has been, because he's a journalist. And journalists are people who report what the scientists have found. And the arguments I've had have actually been with scientists doing research. There is no such thing as God.
So that was hilarious.
I know you've had quite a big.
So let me just unmute you.
Respect that, he's a PhD.
Sorry, you were muted when you were speaking.
Sorry, no, but listen. Okay, he's not a scientist in the lab, but to be fair, he understands very well the scientific method.
Yeah,
he's not naive. He's a PhD. He said zoologist. I consider him to be a legitimate scientific mind. However, he is taking his journalistic skills, his personal opinion, using science to cram it into one book that he knows will sell. If he just wrote about zoology and his personal life, he wouldn't sell any books.
No.
He would just be one in a million. But if he writes something like, I forget the names of his titles, but something, I don't know, what was his name? What's the name of his most famous book?
Selfish Gene.
God Delusion or whatever, right? Is that him?
Yeah, God Delusion, yeah.
Okay, Selfish Gene, if you write God Delusion, you brought in religion now. You're pissing off the Christians, the Muslims, the atheists, the Jews. You're creating there's a market for it.
Yeah.
That was kind of like, okay, that's your opinion, fine. But don't bring science into it, because science is not exclusive to atheists. It's not. People might not know this, but the scientific method was formulated by, so you know this well, Hassan ibn al-Haytham. It's a Muslim invention. People are not going to like that I say this, but look it up. Look it up. It's not Roger and Francis Bacon. It's not the Bacon brothers 600 years later.
They were influenced heavily. Yeah.
Heavily influenced by the Muslim method. Now, why? Look, and the Christians were phenomenal scientists as well. It's not, I'm sure there was science even before Hassan ibn Haytham. I'm saying he formulated the modern day scientific method. I can't sit here and say that Aristotle was not scientifically minded. He was.
Absolutely.
He didn't have the scientific method per se, because it hadn't been invented yet, that particular method that we use today. And it's not an exact method, and it continues to evolve and be, get better and better. But the Sumerians were scientific. The Egyptians were scientific. They didn't call it that. They didn't use the exact same method. However, they used logic and empiricism, inductive and deductive reasoning to figure out the world around them.
Yeah.
I consider that science, not the exact definition of science we have today per se, but nonetheless, he's a scientific guy who used his own personal worldviews and talent as a journalist to sell books and cram his opinion down our throat. And he used it under the guise of science.
Yeah. And it's not
very poor philosophy and very, very, very weak, poor philosophy.
Absolutely. Which is the reason why he doesn't want to debate philosophers. He refused to debate William Lane Craig, but he had no problem going to a Muslim school in London and talking to teenage Muslim girls. He had no problem trying to refute them. John Lennox, the mathematician at Oxford, when he did manage to have 2 discussions with him, he was humiliated.
He was.
Because of his lack of, he did.